Let me start here. The night we are mapping out in this high-stakes thought experiment over the Middle East is not described as a battle. It is described as a verdict. A verdict delivered not in a courtroom, not across a diplomatic table, but written in fire across the skies of northern Israel and felt in the trembling corridors of the Pentagon, thousands of miles away. In this imagined timeline, when the first salvos leave their launch rails in the early hours, the world is still operating under a set of assumptions that have governed regional security thinking for more than 3 decades. By the time the last contrail fades from the horizon in this scenario, every single one of those assumptions has been reduced to ash. Picture 300 missiles and kamikaze drone systems unleashed in a coordinated strike package of a precision and scale that no Western defense analyst has publicly projected as operationally feasible for Iran at this stage. The target is not symbolic. The target is functional, deliberate, and chosen with the cold logic of a military command that has spent years mapping every vulnerability in Israel's defensive architecture. Nevatim Air Base, the primary operating facility for Israel's fleet of F-35I Adir stealth fighters, the crown jewel of the IDF's air superiority doctrine, and the single most expensive military investment the Israeli state has ever made, absorbs direct hits that send columns of black smoke climbing into the morning sky, visible from 40 kilometers away. But the destruction of hangars and aircraft is only the surface of what happens in this scenario. The deeper catastrophe for Tel Aviv is the systematic exposure of Iron Dome, the technological mythology that Israel and its Western backers have spent billions of dollars and decades of messaging constructing as an impenetrable wall between Israeli civilians and any conceivable threat. In this, telling that wall is not breached, it is demolished. Of the 300 inbound targets, fewer than 200 are intercepted. 100 projectiles reach their designated impact points. The mathematics of that failure would haunt Israeli defense planners for a generation and signal something far larger, a potential unraveling of the entire architecture of regional deterrence that has kept the lid on wider war for decades. And then there is the moment that crystallizes everything, the moment that transforms a military engagement into a geopolitical earthquake. As Iranian strike packages are still tracking toward their targets, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group and accompanying vessels quietly begin increasing their distance from the Gulf of Oman. No announcement, no press conference, just the sound of enormous turbines accelerating away from a theater that the United States Navy has always treated as its sovereign operating space. The world's most expensive symbols of American military dominance are repositioning not toward the fight but away from it, and in that retreat the high stakes become brutally clear. This could be the inflection point where American power projection in the Middle East begins to crack under pressure that no amount of diplomacy can paper over. Tonight's analysis will cut through every layer of official narrative to show you exactly what would have happened in such a scenario, why it would have happened, and what it would mean for a region and a world that would never look quite the same again. A world where old alliances fracture, new powers rise, and the risk of uncontrolled escalation hangs over every capital from Washington to Riyadh to Tehran. The mechanics of how a military base housing the most advanced stealth fighters on the planet could be hit by an adversary that Western analysts have spent years describing as technologically outmatched matter because they expose the fragility of assumptions that have guided policy for a generation. Nevatim is not simply another military installation. It is the operational home of Israel's F-35I Adir fleet, 50-plus fifth-generation stealth aircraft that represent the single most significant qualitative military advantage Israel holds over every adversary in its regional environment. These are first-strike weapons designed to penetrate denied airspace, deliver precision munitions against hardened targets, and return without being detected. Israel's entire offensive strategic posture, including any contemplated strike against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, flows through Nevatim. Destroy the aircraft at Nevatim, and you do not just damage the IDF, you surgically remove its capacity for the kind of long-range offensive operations that have defined Israeli military doctrine for the past 2 decades. Iran in this scenario knows exactly what it is targeting. This is a base chosen because eliminating or significantly degrading the F-35 fleet changes the entire military balance of the region in a single operational sequence and raises the specter of a broader conflict that could draw in superpowers. The strike architecture itself is a masterpiece of layered operational design. The opening phase deploys a dense swarm of low-cost decoy UAV systems produced in IRGC manufacturing facilities at a fraction of the per-unit cost of the interceptors they are designed to consume. These decoys force every battery of Iron Dome David sling and arrow interceptors in the northern and central sectors to activate to burn through their ready-to-fire magazines and to saturate the processing capacity of the command and control computers managing the intercept sequence. When a radar system is simultaneously tracking 200+ inbound signatures, the computational load approaches the design ceiling of the system. Response times extend prioritization errors. Increase, and the gaps that open in the coverage matrix are not random. They are the predictable result of an adversary who has studied the system's behavior under saturation conditions for years. Into those gaps comes the second-wave precision-guided ballistic missiles carrying warheads calibrated for hardened infrastructure. The results at Nevatim are captured first by smartphones of Israeli civilians, showing multiple impact points, secondary explosions, and fires the base's own suppression systems cannot contain. The IDF's initial response is silence, which in Israeli military communications culture is itself a signal of the magnitude of what has occurred. Alongside Nevatim, the strike package targets radar installations, power distribution nodes, and intelligence infrastructure in ways that suggest a level of knowledge about Israeli classified systems that would generate serious internal security reviews. The operational conclusion that serious military analysts would draw from this single night is stark and unavoidable. Iran executes a complex multi-axis precision strike campaign against hardened military targets inside one of the most heavily defended territories on the planet, achieves meaningful penetration of that defense architecture, and inflicts measurable damage on the most strategically significant military assets its adversary possesses. That is not the performance of a military organization chronically limited by sanctions. That is the performance of a military organization that has been preparing for this specific mission for a very long time, and in doing so has raised the stakes for everyone involved to the level of potential regional catastrophe. The technical story of this strike begins with the decision Iran made decades ago to treat Western sanctions not as a ceiling on capability, but as an engineering specification. Every component foreign suppliers refuse to provide becomes a design problem to be solved domestically. The result visible in the strike packages that fly in this scenario is a defense industrial base that is genuinely self-sufficient. The primary strike weapon is the K-bar Shekhan, a ballistic missile whose designation translates as fortress breaker, a name that turns out to be operationally accurate in the most literal sense. The guidance architecture uses inertial navigation terrain reference, and in the terminal phase, an active seeker that allows the warhead to identify its aim point independently of external signals. This means the system cannot be defeated by GPS jamming. The terminal phase introduces maneuvering re-entry vehicle behavior, changing approach, angle, and trajectory in ways that defeat the lead angle prediction algorithms that interceptors depend on. Alongside the ballistic component, the strike package integrates upgraded Shahed series, loitering munitions, flying at altitudes that exploit terrain masking. The cost asymmetry embedded in this weapons mix is the financial engine that drives the entire strategic logic. A K-bar Shekhan costs Iran approximately $500,000 to $800,000, while interceptors run into the millions when fired in salvos. This is the economic kill chain that imposes a rate of resource consumption on the defender that cannot be sustained across a protracted conflict. The self-sufficiency dimension is central. The sanctions regime that is supposed to prevent this moment does not prevent it. It accelerates it by forcing Iran to build a domestic industrial depth that now makes its military capability genuinely sanction-proof, and that reality carries stakes high enough to reshape global supply chains and energy security overnight. There is a moment in every geopolitical era when the instruments of power that defined the previous period reveal their limits in a way that cannot be obscured. For the American century, that instrument has been the carrier strike group. In this scenario, two carrier strike groups move away from the Gulf of Oman at speed, increasing their distance from Iranian anti-ship missile engagement envelopes. To understand why, you have to understand what Iran has built in the waters surrounding the Strait of Hormuz over the past 15 years. An anti-access area denial architecture combining long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles like the Khalij-Fars sea-skimming cruise missiles, fast attack craft, and submarines. When American tactical officers run their threat assessment calculations on the night of the strike, the picture is not ambiguous. The Gulf has become a zone where the risk to irreplaceable strategic assets exceeds any reasonable operational justification for remaining. The carriers are symbols of American commitment whose loss would carry consequences far beyond their replacement cost. The decision to reposition is a rational calculation, but the strategic consequences are severe. Every government in the region watches those ships move and draws the same conclusion that American security guarantees carry conditions that were not previously disclosed. For Israel, the implications are even more direct. The F-35s burning at Nevatim are not saved by American intervention. Israel fights this night largely alone, and that exposure changes the calculus of survival in ways that could force desperate choices in the days ahead. There is a quality of military effectiveness that no defense budget can purchase. It is the quality that Iranian military forces demonstrate in this scenario, in every phase of the operation, from patient preparation to disciplined execution. That quality is strategic clarity, the complete alignment between a nation's understanding of why it is fighting, what it is fighting for, and what it is willing to sacrifice. Iran has been in a state of existential confrontation for more than 4 decades, absorbing assassinations, cyber attacks, and sanctions, yet emerging more determined. Compare this to Israel's military power, which rests on a foundation of American equipment funding and resupply. The contrast between Iran's self-sufficiency and Israel's structural dependency is the operational explanation for the outcome. When the foreign patron's calculus changes, the dependent force's options narrow dramatically. Step back from the immediate military details and look at the structural picture that is revealed. What we witness is the operational proof that the unipolar moment is over. The events in the skies over Israel and the waters of the Gulf of Oman constitute empirical evidence that cannot be dismissed. The instrument through which American dominance expressed itself most visibly has been the carrier strike group. In this scenario, Iran demonstrates that it possesses the capability to impose unacceptable costs. For Moscow and Beijing, the events carry strategic confirmation that their investment in the multipolar project has been vindicated. The Gulf states watch with anxiety and recalibration, accelerating conversations about strategic diversification. The broader global South draws its own conclusions that self-sufficiency is achievable and Western technological superiority is not inevitable. The old order in the Middle East built on Israeli qualitative superiority American power projection and containment of Iran is stress-tested and shows fractures. A new order is beginning to take shape, more multipolar, more contested technologically. The question that will define the next phase is whether the other actors will adapt their strategic frameworks to the new reality quickly enough to prevent the transition from passing through a phase of catastrophic general conflict. What plays out over the skies of Israel in this scenario and across the waters of the Gulf of Oman is a turning point, the kind that gets a chapter in history books. Iron Dome does not hold. The F-35 base does not survive intact. The carriers do not stay. and the world that emerges from this night is not the world that entered it. The trajectory of the debate that follows will shape the Middle East, and by extension, the global energy and security architecture for the next decade at minimum. The situation is moving fast, and the stakes could not be higher.